Hello, everyone. Welcome to our highlight talk of the day for Dialogues. I'm very, very pleased and happy to introduce RoseLee Goldberg, the director of Performa, and Eric Scheiner, the director of the Warhol Museum. And I will let them get to it.
Thank you so much. We are very happy to be here today, and I am especially happy to be interviewing my dear friend RoseLee Goldberg, the ultimate goddess of performance art. And I decided that in starting this conversation, I wanted to ask RoseLee something that's always been in my mind to ask, and I've never done it. I wanted to start the conversation by asking you, what was that first performative act that lit this spark within you that may have been art, it may not have been art, but what got the gears going to get you into this deep interest in performance art?
Well, first to say, we're about to have a lot of fun because we don't get to have conversations too often. So thanks for making this possible. I'm going to go two ways. What's that early spark? That's a bit like saying, what were you doing when you were 5 years old? Anybody want to offer something? Actually, I started out as a tap dancer, so there you go. But then I'm going to jump ahead and talk about the history of art, because I am an art historian. And above all, really to dive in right from the start about a certain kind of this important relevance of performance to the history of contemporary art, which is what this conversation is about. So I wanted to take you to a first picture that we have here, and really talking about the physical importance of performance art, talking about, oh, you're right, thank you. Does that work?
There we go.
Okay. So you probably don't know who these figures are, or if you do, you should know that it's actually one and the same person. This is an artist called Schlemmer, and some of you probably know about the Bauhaus. Actually, quick question, I need to know who I'm talking to. Any doctors in the house? Yay, got a doctor. Any artists in the house? Okay. Any professional dancers in the house? I know you're sitting up straighter than everybody else. Okay. Ex-dancer, good. What about writers? Okay. Any theater people? Good. This is really helpful because, again, it takes us where we're going through this thing called what is performance art, and how we're really talking about a material that looks across a lot of different disciplines. Back to your question. Oskar Schlemmer is teaching at the Bauhaus in 1923, and he is both a painter, a sculptor, well actually he's more than that, he's a painter, a sculptor, draftsman, and he's also a dancer. And this really is getting back this idea of answering that question, where's that moment where we're looking at art that somehow is all of those things? It's the work of a visual artist who's a sculptor, who's teaching. He's teaching at the Bauhaus, and he's also a dancer. And he writes, if any of you read German, his diaries are amazing, where he talks about this conflict. He says this conflict of being a dancer and a painter in a very Germanic way. He ties it into Goethe. He says Goethe talked about this constant adolescence that we have, the way we discover ourselves in theater and in painting. So Schlemmer, for me, was that moment, and maybe the beginning of the moment of writing about performance art in the early 70s, was because he really talks about this relationship. He talks about being the painter as being his intellectual side, his Apollo, the theater side being Dionysus. So again, I hope this opens up a lot of thoughts in each of you who are straddling several disciplines at once. So Schlemmer, for me, was that moment that said, this is serious. This is somebody looking at what it feels like to be a dancer, working in a physical space, to be a painter and a sculptor working with physical material. So it's the materiality of those two that I think are really important for you to remember.
Absolutely. And of course, when you talk about a multidisciplinary artist, Andy Warhol, of course, pops up. And it's funny that you wanted to be a tap dancer. Andy Warhol wanted to be a tap dancer too, except he couldn't dance. Could you dance?
Very well.
See, I could tell. So, flash forward, you're in school in South Africa. You
Yes.
make a leap and go to London. Can you tell us a little bit about those early days?
Yes, thank you. All this biography, but it's interesting because I think the way we read anybody's work, somehow that biography plays quite a role. Again, imagine South Africa during the apartheid era. A little hard for you to picture from this point in time. There was still curfew for black people. They had to be off the streets by 10:30 at night. There was this extraordinary separation, really apartheid in living quarters and every aspect of the culture. Growing up there in a very privileged environment, because somehow I was on the side that this apartheid was being legally pushed or illegally pushed into place. I think those very, very early years were extremely important for me to look at the way art, culture, politics all connected. And the other thing that was very interesting was growing up in South Africa was multiculturalism before that word became so popular in the 80s. I grew up listening to Zulu music on the radio, seeing Zulu dancing on the streets, hearing voices. I was also grew up in Durban, which is part of right on the Indian Ocean, and very big Indian population. So I actually studied Bharatanatyam, which is classical Indian dancing, saw people in saris, went down to the Indian markets, and then, of course, British colonialism. Jumped from there to London was really partly to get out of South Africa because of the politics was unbearable. That's another conversation. But to go to the Courtauld in London was actually, again, following these many leads. I was studying art history, I did a fine art degree, and then I wanted to find ways to try to understand all these elements, and ended up at the Courtauld in London.
And I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I visited South Africa in 1992 when apartheid was still underway, and had the great honor of going with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and was able to see what he was doing to try to affect positive change. Met Nelson Mandela at that time as well. And of course, they became my heroes immediately. And to see that social condition coming from the United States was just beyond shocking, and in many ways has inspired me to do the work that I do. And I know that's been the same with you. Now, as you started your curatorial practice, did you always from day one figure out a way to make performance art part of your exhibition program?
Absolutely. Firstly, curatorial practice. Are there any curatorial practitioners here? Okay. Did you all go to curatorial school? No, me neither. Okay, so let's scrap that. Sorry if there's anyone running a curatorial department here. We love you dearly. But I think for me, the only way to deal with curatorial futures is really through an enormous amount of history, just accumulating history, politics, culture, just really knowing a lot of history. So from day one, I got a job at the Royal College of Art as director of the gallery, just out of school. And frankly, I didn't know if you paid artists to exhibit or they paid you. I had no clue. But, somebody threw me in the deep end. And right from that moment, I said, we're going to show all these different kinds of art going on in the school. And actually, the Royal College, some of you know, is a very interesting graduate school and has many different departments. So it has ceramics and sculpture and painting and all the, architecture and design and so on. So that was, again, a perfect environment. And from day one, we had Brian Eno was a good friend of mine. I had Brian come into class and do events in the gallery. Marina Abramovich, this is 1972, Christo, Carl Andre coming, Christian Boltanski, these all names I'm sure you know. So from the very beginning, this idea was this has to be live, living. It's in a school of art, a really extraordinary school of art, and we've got to find ways to animate this. So the Kipper Kids, I'm sure some of you know about the Kipper Kids. So it was music, dance, film, design, food, architecture from day one, and that was my idea about how I had to be a curator.
And the same with me, and I agree with you fully. You cannot teach someone how to be a curator, and certainly the graduate programs, of which there are many today, I think may try to sell that as a potential outcome of having gone through this program, but we all know that it takes constant on-the-ground hanging out with artists as much as you possibly can, seeing as many shows as you possibly can, and reading about history, again, as much as humanly possible. And I think those life experiences all combined begin to maybe give you the skill set to become a curator, but also believing in the magic of art. And that's something for me that drives me forward, and I know you as well. Now, when you made the transition over to New York, what took you to the city in the first place?
Kojak. Anyone like Kojak? I used to watch Kojak in London all the time. I thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. I mean, that guy with a sense of humor who's just fantastic. I was also reading a lot of Raymond Chandler. Los Angeles had great appeal. And then I visited New York the first time, and I saw 2,000 square feet for $200 a month. That was called a loft in Soho. Sorry, guys, you can't even get a toilet seat for $200 anymore. So I came to New York. It was just instantly the 70s. I don't know if I would feel the same way if I came now. And I saw like 200 feet for $2,000 square dollars a month. Yes, just instantly, New York was extraordinary. Everything below 14th Street, we owned it. People were scared to come downtown. Good. We liked it that way. There were very few lights in the street. Every loft was another artist that you knew, or, you know, Joan Jonas was living across the road. Vito Conchi was 2 doors down the road. It really was a real community in every imaginable sense. We were all hanging out, talking through the night all the time. So that's, for me, why I just had to move to New York.
And what a perfect greenhouse of performance-based practice at that very moment in time. And Joan and everyone just figuring that out is part of their practice, part of their presentation. Who was the first artist that you showed in New York, and where was that?
I was invited to be the curator at the kitchen, the old kitchen on Broome Street and Worcester in '78, just when I finished the book, actually. I finished my performance art book. And the first person I showed was actually Robert Longo. And the second person was Cindy Sherman. I showed her film stills. We pinned them on the wall with thumbtacks, and I begged people to buy them for $50 each.
And those people did very well.
No, nobody bought a single one.
Same as Warhol's Brillo boxes. He sold maybe 5.
Right. So, and right from the start, again, the kitchen, the idea was I introduced a gallery there and also a small video room. And so from day one, it was, again, all the arts all the time. We had to always be looking at this spectrum of different kinds of art.
And if you haven't read RoseLee's book, it is the Bible of performance arts studies. So by all means, track down a copy and read the book. It is still heavily utilized in classrooms across the world, and it's been translated into how many languages?
I don't know, about 12 or 14. It's just come out in Russian, so if you want to read in Russian, let me know. Yes, it's still
fantastic.
around.
And the book was an extension of your graduate work and your life work. And how long did it take you to complete that project specifically?
The book?
Yeah.
I actually wrote the book in about I think just a year and a half.
Wow.
Yes. Don't ever listen when they tell you to take 6 years to write your PhD. Just do not listen. It can be done much shorter.
As it should be. Certainly having been in a PhD program at Yale, the average at the time that I was there was 9 years to complete the PhD. I'm a beauty school dropout, so I left after 2 years with my master's degree, and everything seemed to work out perfectly well in the end. Indeed. So, as you start with curatorial practice in the city, obviously there's a lot to choose from. There's a constant energy in the city. And as you made note of, I think that's changed a lot today, but you've been able to keep it alive with Performa. And how did you first come up with this idea that Performa, as a biennial of performance art, was A, critical and necessary to the lifeblood of New York City? Well,
your point about New York in the 70s, I was feeling in 2004 that New York was getting way too grown up, too corporate. Everything seemed to be coming from above. And I think at that point, it actually makes 2014 sound like child's play, but everybody was talking about the price of art and the higher rising prices of art, and it just seemed like it was necessary to get back to talking about the world of ideas again. And plus, with a little romance, but was thinking about those early days when we had so much of a community, there was such a conversation, and I felt there had to be another way to really drum up trouble from the bottom. I mean, people were saying then, oh, the art world's moving to London, oh, the art world's moving to Shanghai, oh, it's going to Berlin. I said, you know what, I'm not going anywhere. We got the great town here, so let's make it edgy all over again. So that was really the starting point. I can show a few slides quickly if just to tell you how I got to that point. I just wanted to finish out some of these other Oskar Schlemmer images, which are pretty amazing, just so you realize why I was convinced that this was a legitimate place to begin with, the artist also being, the visual artist being a performer, making art that somehow straddles both. This is something called the metal dance that Schlemmer also designed in the 20s. This was a great part of the parties that they had at the Bauhaus, where you actually entered this little party on this trolley. So again, the inventiveness of the art school. The art school is something that really affects the lives of the students who were there. Beautiful costume by Schlemmer made out of glass. So these are the things that inspired me when I started looking for artists to actually create live performance. And this was the slat dance.
And then certainly even a little bit before this, you think of the futurists in Italy, and you think about the Mavo artists in Japan in the 1910s, and life as performance, masquerade, sculpture, and there they are. Boom.
Another thing, just since we're throwing all this art history at you as well, I think a little bit of art history is a very good antidote to an art fair. So we just thought we'd give you a little art history background. Always remember, if you're an artist, be very well dressed. It helps. But the other key about the futurists is that really this idea, once again, of bringing a lot of people together from different disciplines. I mean, Marinetti, the poet, literally came up with the idea, well, let's get one architect, one dancer, one movie maker, one musician, and somehow that mix, that bringing people together from a lot of different disciplines was really important. So just quickly racing through, again, some of the ways that I'm going back and forth a little bit here, but the way Performa operates, one of the reasons I started too was to look at this history finally. Because as you know, and I'm sure a lot of you carry that idea, most people think of performance art as somebody who's, just cut themselves and sitting for 9 hours watching the blood drip out or something. And it's usually thought of in fairly kind of annoying ways. And to me, it's such a rich history. That was another reason to start Performa, and to say, let's look at this material. It's been left out of art history, but we really need to understand it. 1913, anyone into garage music and noise machines? This was 1913, noise machines. We rebuilt them, and we've been touring them for the last 7 years. And plus, we've also commissioned young artists to make new pieces for those sound machines. We'll skip some of the early Russian material, but I did want to take you through this different parts of this history. This is really a very beautiful piece from 1924. Again, if you go to Broadway, you won't see theater like this. This was amazing material. The artists were involved working with the designers in the 20s in Russia. And this was, again, some of the ways we take inspiration. We had a wonderful event that we based on this early event from 24. And again, just some of the magnificent kinds of theatricality that was coming out of this combination of visual artists working with theater people. Audience, always good to remember. I like to include that one. I think it's something we should always keep in mind. The audience of performances. And let's just, this is New York in 1972, which is why I wanted to move there. This is what Soho really looked like. In my dreams, it still looks like that. Just remove a couple of Chanel. And that was outside my loft in 75 on Mercer Street. Nobody moved it for 6 months. And so that was really intriguing. That's just, APC on Mercer Street. It's right there. And, that shouldn't be there, but I just thought I'd put it there. It was just to remind you, it was called Manpower. I loved it. This was in the mid-'70s when we were talking about feminism. I thought they were still doing ads called Manpower. It was really important.
Wow.
You won't guess, but the lady in black is actually Cindy Sherman doing early dress up. So again, you know, early performance. And okay, I did want to bring you to this question that you asked me about starting Performa. I was really feeling by 2004 that, well, late 1900s, 1990s actually, that so much art we were seeing was so gorgeous. I mean, we were looking at Sharon, we were looking at Isaac Julian, we're looking at people, Douglas Gordon, Stan Douglas, all, actually a lot of it film-related, these big, beautiful installations. And what I was missing was that quality of work in performance. I was really, there were a lot of monologues going on, and monologue, and I thought, if I see one more monologue, I'm going to do like that Iraqi guy did. You take your shoe off and you throw it. You say, stop, I can't stand another monologue. So there was this beautiful piece of Sharon Neshat that she did at Venice Biennial. And I came back to New York from seeing it, and I said to Sharon, you know, you have all the ingredients for an extraordinary performance. You have this visual, cinematic choreography. You have the sound of the singers. It's art, it's politics, it's East and West, it's men and women, it's black and white, it's everything that one should be thinking about at this time. Would you consider doing a live performance? So that was really the beginning of this idea of commissioning new work from an artist who's not ever done live performance before. And that's one of the characters of Performa, that we commission work by artists. So it's not just performance art. We commission work by artists who've never done performance before. And the results are phenomenal. And I think that's why there's been such a big change.
Absolutely.
With Performa.
I think that artists just naturally love to be challenged with thinking about their practice and their process in very new ways, and to think about new vehicles of delivery. And I know that Performa has brought so much great opportunity to them. What did just if the audience isn't familiar, what exactly did she do for the performance?
So this is part of the film she made, and it was a 3-part film. Was actually filmed with, in a limestone quarry up in Massachusetts. And this was my dream come true, where she did exactly what I imagined she might do, which literally have the performers come off the film into the space. And you see a little bit of it here from the workshop that was first done, where it's a film triptych and this beautiful hour-long piece that came out of Sharon's work.
From a practical standpoint, how did you solicit patrons and support to make Performa happen from the get-go?
Do you want to turn the sound down a little bit? Well, that's such a big question for all of us who art historians and sort of academics who grew up, as I did, in a family that said, don't talk about money in front of the children. So that was not easy. But I actually decided with Sharon that it was now or never. So I said, would she do this? And she said yes. And I thought, now what do I do? And beginner's luck, I literally knocked on the door at Peter Norton's in Los Angeles. I happened to be there, and I described the project, and he said, fantastic, how much do you need? First mistake. I said, 25,000. He said, oh, fine, that's all? Anyway,
always add a zero.
Yes, right. So it's taken me a while. It took me a while to learn better, but it's a very interesting process. I now use that with all young curators that I work with. My mantra is fund the idea. If you have an idea, you better figure out how to fund it. And it's a really interesting relationship and a better understanding of what it means to be in this cultural world that we're all privileged enough to function in. What are the mechanics for not only supporting extraordinary organizations like the Warhol Foundation and all the other so-called nonprofits? What does it take? What knowledge does it take? How do we work in relationship to fairs and to collectors and to patrons? And my other call to patrons actually is, for every dollar you put on the wall, please put it back into this community that actually nurtures the next generation, because that's really where it's going to come from.
And it's critical that all of us pay very close attention to the next generations. And just remember, in whatever capacity you can, make sure you're thinking about middle school kids and elementary school kids, and how do we plant the seeds to make sure that across the board we have a really fantastic cadre of professionals coming in with these dreams and desires, not only in curatorial practice, but as artists as well. It's part of our responsibility, I think, running cultural organizations to make sure that we do that. Now, certainly something that we haven't yet discussed, all of these performances need to be recorded and documented in some capacity, and it's certainly something that's been a fairly relatively new topic, and I know that you and Klaus have worked very hard to make sure there are systematic ways to record performance. Do you want to talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. You know, I think this business of, I think performance has actually been recorded a lot longer than we realize, just in different ways. In fact, people are always talking to me at the moment about, you know, collecting performance or putting performance into the museum. And my response is, you know, it's been hiding in plain sight for the last century. You just don't call it performance. You have futurist paintings, you have futurist noise recordings, you actually have writings. They're all different kinds of ways of recording. And artists have been recording their performances all these years. And in fact, if you think the last 25 years, most of the artists that we follow in the contemporary art scene, whether it's Matthew Barney, Dominic Gonzalez Foster, Mike Kelly, Paul McCarthy, etc. These are all artists that we associate with performance, but we don't call it that. We just say they're contemporary artists. But that work is already in the museum. It is, in fact, you know, McCarthy's videos, Pierre Weig's films, those are recordings of performances. That's where it begins. So we're actually looking at a very rich history of documentation. And artists, you know, obviously in the last 40 years, certainly are very, very aware of that. So when they make a piece, they typically are finding ways to record those pieces. So there's a huge amount. The documentation exists. It's of a very, very high caliber, and it's actually in the museum right here in this town. But we're not used to looking at that work and say, that was actually a performance first before it became a film.
No, absolutely. And you did the exhibition 100 days as a survey of sorts.
100 years of performance.
100 years, of course. And what was the underpinning of that exhibition happening, and where did it go, and what do you think the end result of that exhibition was?
That exhibition actually came out in I wanted to celebrate the 100th year of Futurism, which was in 1909, so it was for 2009. Actually, Klaus had invited me to just, at that point they didn't know what they were doing with PS1, like take over the museum, you can have it. And I said the one show I've always wanted to do was 100 years of performance art, i.e. once again to show very dramatically that this has existed as way back as, you know, that the 20th century has actually been a multidisciplinary century, and that the separation into painting and sculpture is just so short-sighted. I mean, Futurist, Dada, Duchamp, Surrealism, go through your art history, it's all been about some kind of action and some kind of activism. So that show was really to make that point very, very clearly, that there's a 100-year history. And surprisingly what it did show, because my idea was 100 years, 100 monitors, we will do one thing from each year. Of course, that was hard. You had more things than 100. But what was beautiful about it, and very surprising to me, was how extremely interesting it was as a history of documentation. Because there was early 60s, and then it goes from black and white film to to color, to HD, and photographs and drawings, and that goes all the way from Léger and Picasso and Bauhaus all the way to the present. So it's an amazing show that actually I also feel is a new kind of show, because I say it will never end. It's a rolling stone, and it just keeps gathering mass. And we took it to Moscow, and we've taken it to Germany, and we brought it here. And then there's another version of that, a shorter version that goes to Krakow and Poland next month, and so on.
And it's so important that those shows exist, not only so that we know the history, but also, again, so that young would-be artists will have exposure and get those little sparks of genius so that they can carry things forward. So Performa, now in its 10th year, what's been your biggest source of pride for Performa?
That's not quite the word, but yes, lots of excitement. What's always so exciting is that artists don't say no; they say yes, and they leap off. And like you said, they're just artists are just sort of molecules of imagination. So somehow giving somebody an idea to and the possibility and saying there are no limits. I don't go and say, here's 15K or whatever, and that's it. We really start with what's the idea and, be ambitious and dream on. So the quality of the work has been really very thrilling. In some ways, my insistence that the art history is finally understood and absorbed and finally in the museums, I think has been a very important part of this drive to make people pay attention. And by now, I think, all the major museums are starting to build performance art departments. It's really becoming the medium of the 21st century because it is so multi-layered and multi-tiered. There'll always be painting and sculpture, but this next stage of what media can do and what artists can do with media, and the fact that people work in so many disciplines at once, multitasking, all of that, but that this can be turned into an aesthetic form and used as performance. I think we're going to be seeing more and more, as we are everywhere, more and more performance.
I agree fully, and luckily I've had the honor of attending Performa events since day one, really, with Jesper back in the early days, and many over. One of the highlights for me was Liz Magic Laser and her performance, where I have this strange rule where I don't like to participate in a work of art if I'm commissioning it or involved with it in any capacity, or really in general. I never want it to, be about me or the curatorial hand or anything like that. So I hate interactive, when you become part of the performance sort of things. And Liz, I thought I was going to be completely safe, seated in the middle of a row, actors at least starting in the front, but then quickly infiltrating the audience. And before I knew it, I had an actress straddling my lap with high-def cameras on us. And that became such a fully environmental performance, both psychological and physical. It was genius.
Totally.
Indeed. How many of you have been to a Performa event? Okay, just a few. Luckily, RoseLee has brought Performa here to Chicago with Rashid Johnson and his Dutchman performance, which is running right now as we speak in Chicago every evening. And
late, very late.
Very late. It starts at 11 p.m. at a bathhouse on West Division Street. Have any of you gone to see the performance this week? Yes, there's a few. It's still running, and it goes until, I believe, Sunday night is the last night. Are there tickets left, or is it sold out?
There are a few tickets left.
By all means, I would recommend going. Do you want to
just take your bathing suit with you if you're shy about wandering around in a robe? Yes, it's pretty amazing. It's a wonderful piece. Just to give you a little story, Rashid, I'm sure you all know because he's like the king of Chicago, has told me he'd been thinking about this for years, about how to do something in the baths, because he is somebody who goes to baths regularly. And so last year he finally came and said, I really know what I want to do, and he selected this extraordinary play by Maria Baraka, old name was Leroy Jones, called Dutchman, which is a very disturbing and frightening play about two young couple on a subway. Young black man, young white woman. She gets on the subway and taunts him, and it ends up in a horrific attack between the two of them. Point is, Rashid brilliantly transposes the subway to a bathhouse where you're literally that close up to the action, and it's that hot and that disturbing. And I just thought Rashid, again, taking on a subject like that and putting it in this very intense environment when we're just endlessly still dealing with race and culture and class in this country, was, again, a very brave and adventurous move on his part. And we're excited at Performa to be able to just say yes when somebody comes up with something as maybe difficult to produce as that. But yes, we did it. And the two actors are sitting here. So thank you for being here.
And it is so necessary that we continue those very conversations. And that piece in that very specific place literally turns up the heat as the action in the play develops. So too do you start sweating a lot more because the heat is building up, and it feels as though you can't escape, not only from the psychological torment that the two incredibly talented actors deliver, but that physical space. And why don't you talk a little bit about site specificity and how important that is to performance and what unfolds?
That's a great idea. What time do we have, by the way? Are we okay?
We are fine,
Good.
so we'll open it up to questions soon.
Okay, so I'm going to show you a few different examples. I mean, that's one of the things that is very important to Performa is, well, several issues, that I wanted to slow down time. I feel that we all spend way too little time the way we race through galleries, exhibitions, fairs. I think there's some ridiculous statistics that you barely have a few seconds on each work. 2 seconds on each work. So I take the opposite as really sort of lock you in the room with the artist and say, you're going to pay attention. But the other thing there too is really finding that perfect frame, finding a space that really works. So I'm going to show you a little bit of an introduction film. This was opening night in 2005 that you remember, Jesper Just. It's a piece by, there's only one live actor. That's the gentleman on your right. Everything else is projected. And it was a really amazing piece that we decided again how we were going to do that. It was done in a white box, but we built a little theater into the box. And also I didn't let anyone sit down because I didn't want this confusion that it was theater. I wanted you to stand up and look at it as you would visual art. A really, really great way to open Performa because it really talked about commissioning new work for the future, things that we just never seen before. And so, again, this particular environment was, as I said, was in a big white gallery space. It wasn't quite a gallery, but with a special box that we built for it. This is another scene that's actually where the figure jumps into the film, a kind of old magic trick. So he actually leaves the stage and jumps into the film. And now the two figures are inside the film and no longer on the stage. This is another site-specific work by Francis Elise, which we actually did in a strip club in Lower East Side in London. In New York. It's a real stripper, to my surprise. I had my son actually had the fortune of filming all the strippers who came in for interviews. And then we uploaded them in a special secret place for Francis Elise to choose the stripper. I thought, well, maybe we'd get an actress and she could pretend to be a stripper, but he saw right through it immediately. What happens here is that it's their singing leader, Schubert leader, the stripper is stripping, and when they stop to rehearse, she has to put her clothes back on. So it takes her 2 hours to take her clothes off. Anyway, so again, a different place. I thought this would be very odd to do it in a gallery, so we found a strip club where we did that, and everybody came to the strip club. This next one. So this is a work by Laurie Simmons, and she took her early photographs from the 90s and converted them into a live performance with Alvin Ailey dancers, really beautiful film, which in fact remained a film, so that's another kind of frame. In the end, it just seemed too difficult to find a way to do it live because the costumes actually weigh a lot. So it was done as a very, very beautiful film. This is another work, very beautiful work by Isaac Julian that took place. It was a combination with Brooklyn Academy of Music and Sadler's Wells in London, so by then we had learned how to create partnerships. It's actually about the first African American to go to the North Pole, Matthew Henson. Very, very beautiful piece. And again, just so you understand, we do things that the range is really huge. Can be on a park bench or Brooklyn Academy, an opera stage. It can be really the whole gamut. So again, finding the perfect place for things. This is another scene from that. This was a work by Francis Elise that he did at the Guggenheim Museum, where he used the entire space up down and below. He pulled out every stop he had with all the superstars. So Natalie Portman is there with a mustache. Kate Blanchett was down below. So it's actually a very imaginative piece of theater and an extraordinarily imaginative piece of use of the Guggenheim Museum, where it's literally that was the underground, the Peter Lewis Theater underground. And you can see on the top what's going on. So there's action going on in 5 different places in the Guggenheim. Beautiful work by Adam Pendleton, again a very different piece. Amazing piece. He was only 23 at the time. He lied to me. Told me he was 23. He told me he's 28, but he was really 23. Nevertheless, we also produced something extraordinary from him. 30-member gospel choir. This was a remarkable work of Natalie Goldberg, who's typically a claymation artist. But we put this in a very sort of dilapidated little theater in New York. Clearly these children are throwing grenades and beating the hell out of each other. Part 2, they end up in the hospital. And the real exciting conceit here is that she did the soundtrack live. So that was, again, a very interesting aspect. So all the work that we're looking at here, I hope it just changes your idea of what you think might be performance. Because the range has been as remarkable as there are artists in this world. And again, the environment always switches. We look at the work, we hear what the artist is telling us, and then we find that space. Or in the case of Rashid, he said, I know where I want it to be. I want to be in a bathhouse. That's what I want. So the space, I think, becomes very interesting. It's actually part of the fun of Performa, too, is that people discover New York in a way they've never seen it before. Let me see. Oh, this is a good one. This took place on the rooftop of Christian Jankowski's space.
As you look toward the future of Performa, do you want to keep it specifically in New York, or do you think that some sort of a satellite option may be doable?
It's totally doable. We have any millionaires in the house? It's it's more than that. We've actually been international from the very beginning. We've taken things to China. We've toured a lot of work. We've taken projects to Chile and so on. I think it's absolutely. Many of these projects are ready to go singly. What's more complicated is to try to produce a whole weekend somewhere. But no, indeed, I think there's more and more leads us to seeing that that's really a way to go.
Any millionaires who happen to be in the house, please see RoseLee after the
You'll get a lot of excitement. The whole world will follow you and thank you. And actually, or corporate, whatever, all those things. We're very good at all that. We get 5 million hits on our website during the biennial, during 3 weeks. I think that's interesting. I need a 12-year-old to explain to me what to do with that. But the fact is, 5 million hits on our website. So it says there's enormous amount of interest around the world, by all kinds of generations and people looking to what this work can possibly be.
No, absolutely. So why don't we open the floor up to the audience. If you have questions, please go ahead and ask. Yes, we do have a microphone, by the way, so wait until we have the mic come down. It's coming right now.
Hi. Do you find it problematic anytime distinguishing between performance art and the traditional performing arts, that may be doing experimental work or anything like that? That's
a great question, and that's why I wanted to just find a little time to give you some visuals to attach to that question. What's fascinating is that we all exist here with so many different facets of places where we enter the world. So in terms of theater, to be a theater person versus a visual art person, I think it's quite easy to break down some of those categories. And if you're in theater, you start with language. You very typically begin with a text. If you're in visual art, you're starting with visuals. Text doesn't really play a role at all. Theater is collaborative. There's a writer, there's a director, there's a lighting designer. There are many different people. It is a collaborative art, in a way like filmmaking. Art world, forget it. It's one man or one woman. It's pretty much a singular vision. Even if an artist might work with a dancer, might work with a cinematographer, it's really that artist's choice all the way through. So these nuances get obviously play off a lot of different categories, and there's some people who, as you say, there's definitely experimentation going on. In fact, we don't see enough of it in this country, but all the festivals in Europe, very avant-garde theater festivals, I don't think we see enough of that. But it's still interesting that the reference point for those working in the visual art is still very much about the history of art. So there's slightly different, there's always these nuanced differences of where that focuses, where that conversation. So it becomes a very conceptual reference. Are you familiar with Tino Segal's work? Tino actually comes out of dance and comes from a very classical dance background and classical avant-garde dance, and yet he moves into the art world. And so the considerations, the references he's making to the art world are about that conversation. And in fact, most people in the art world aren't very aware of where he's coming from in the dance world. So we're talking about a lot of very specialized worlds that sometimes overlap. Sometimes they seem to be the same thing. Well, sometimes they are the same thing. But usually that reference is, where did you grow up? Did you grow up in the art world? Did you grow up in the theater world? And you're going to have very different references.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was very happy to see the photographs of... Thank you. I was very happy to see the photographs of Oskar Schlemmer's Bauhaus dances because I toured in them for about 10 years in Deborah McCall's reconstructions. And what was so incredibly satisfying about that experience, besides the research and the performance itself, is that in a loft in Tribeca, we recreated the laboratory that was the Bauhaus. So we worked with 20-somethings and 80-somethings, an original weaver, the stage designer from the original Bauhaus. We had sound installation artists and color theorists and art historians and furniture designers, and it was so satisfying to be immersed in that environment. And wherever we toured, that's who constituted the audiences too. So it was incredibly successful for audience development. So why do we not have laboratories anymore where all these multidisciplines are developing multidisciplinary work?
Can I sign
together?
you up, please? No, I mean, that's for Performa to work with us. This is what Performa really is doing, is that we are finding ways to knit together all these different disciplines. We're working with, that's the whole, it's really that starting point. It's exactly as you describe it. I'm sure you were talking about Weininger and his wife and that whole extraordinary group. And it's that motif to bring people from very different disciplines together that is what drives Performa. So I hope you'll come and join us in whatever capacity. Yes.
Earlier you mentioned the importance of bringing art to youth, and I was wondering if Performa was doing anything to get youth involved with these projects or to get them in the audience.
Yeah, we're all thinking about that all the time. Actually, one of the beautiful program that we had in 2007 was to start a kids program to document the work. Which was really terrific. And so there were about 8. They were like in the 12 to 18-year-old age group, which is actually a very difficult age group, by the way, to raise funding for. They're kind of neglected. And a lot of our documentation, because again, we're such a, we work with such a mean and lean budget, and everything that we do is like trying to be as inventive as we can. A lot of that material is actually shot from that year, is shot by these kids. So we had everybody we could gather to try to train them. We got cameras. I try to get NYU involved where I teach. So that was one of those programs that I would love to see continue, but it's, again, something that's very specific. As far as, again, the young, we're reaching out in every way we can. It's just, and a lot of the work, I think, is really being followed, obviously, by a very young generation. I think performance is by nature. People are really looking for the new and the different. How young we can go, there's been different projects that fit, very particular projects that can fit that category. Oh, we had a great project in 2007 where it was haircutting by children. And you could go to Chinatown, and these kids were cutting hair. Fabulous. It was absolutely amazing. And a lot of people would go and have their hair cut there. They sort of end up, like... So that was haircuts by children. They've definitely, we always try to have one or two projects like that within the programming. So stay posted or send us ideas. We're always looking for that.
Other questions? I have a quick question that's very specific to this week, particular in Chicago, in the opening of the David Bowie Is exhibit tonight at the MCA. And the Chicago Tribune called me last week to ask what I thought of this venerable arts organization here in Chicago having the audacity, at least that's what the reporter seemed to be alluding to, of doing this exhibition about a rock star. And I said, are you kidding? It's the most fabulous show I've ever seen. I saw it in Toronto. And it takes the concept of performance to a whole nother place. Did you see the show yet? Or?
Regrettably, I haven't seen it. I'm going to see it tonight. I'm very excited. But a couple of things. What did David Bowie, John Lennon, Brian Eno have in common? They all went to art school. Exactly. So let's not be surprised by that. So send your kid to art school. They could end up being David Bowie. Another thing is, the whole discussion between high and low, the whole idea of popular culture, speak to Madonna, speak to Jay-Z, you get to a certain place and a certain ability to articulate the culture with enormous amount of knowledge. And a little personal anecdote, which I shouldn't even talk about, but actually David Bowie once said, I was talking with him and talking specifically about performance and actually about the Bauhaus and about futurism. And he is so knowledgeable about that material. He went on and on. I was more thrilled than one can imagine of actually having him talk about futurism and, about the costume, where he was getting his costumes from and what he was looking at. There's no mistake. He knows this material. To then cross over, I'm sure the show is fabulous. It's our job as historians and curators and cultural commentators to try to understand all those layers of how so-called high art and popular culture, something that Andy Warhol taught us and kept trying to really insist that this is something that was understood. I mean, Warhol in 1980 changed the history of art by doing one thing that more important than a lot of the other things he did. He went to Studio 54 and the art world followed him there. I mean, art world people didn't usually dance to, those light things. What are they called?
Disco balls?
Disco balls. They learned how to dance because Warhol was there, and his kind of comment. And I'm being a little ironic, but it's actually a real art historical moment of the art world going uptown and sort of learning this other reference point. So I think it's great. Can't wait to see it.
No, it's an absolutely genius show. And there's a video in the show of David actually visiting Warhol in the factory in 1971 on his first trip to New York. And he starts to perform pantomime because he'd been studying pantomime. And strangely, it freaked Andy out. So Andy excused himself and went and hid in the back room. And they never really were that close at all, David and Andy. They certainly saw each other over various points in times. But again, this reporter was very shocked that we didn't take the show at the Andy Warhol Museum. And I said, well, they met a few times. That does not mean that I should be furthering that conversation along. So I'm very happy it's here in Chicago.
Right.
Well, if you don't have any other questions, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Art Expo Chicago for welcoming us here.
Thank you.
Yep.